Ever wondered how we got from this to this? Well, welcome to RayStation, and this is the evolution of the PlayStation controller. Before we get started, please do remember to hit that subscribe button and that notification bell icon. It'll help a lot. It'll keep you up to date with everything I got planned in the future. And without further ado, let's get right into the video, shall we? Where better to begin than the very first PlayStation controller? Now, what set this controller apart from its contemporaries like the SNES was that Teiju Goto, the designer of the PlayStation up until the PlayStation 3, added to a basic SNES controller hand grips. This was because he was inspired by the 3D focus of the console. Everyone else kind of went with 2D moving forward, and you can see that by the very controller they were using. The SNES controllers were flat, and he wanted something that popped out, something that caught your eye. And the story of how this got pushed forward as the official design of the controller is a whole different video. So comment below if you want me to cover that as well. But what we can see here is that it is the base SNES controller with hand grips, but with a few added functionality. We had a second set of shoulder buttons, rounding out the L1, L2, R1, R2 set, which you will see up to the very current gen of the PlayStation controller. What else do we have here? We have the Sony logo in the middle, PlayStation logo, and the select and start button. To your right, you have the face buttons, triangle, circle, X, and square, which each of them have a meaning apparently. Teiju Goto chose these shapes for a very specific reason. Like I said, if you want me to cover it, I can do that in a different video. But if I cover it here, this will make a very long video, won't it? So on the left, there is the D-pad, and that rounds out the very basic controller. On the other side, we have the controller port, proprietary, with a Sony logo on it, and yeah, the very first controller. But one thing people don't realize was there are two versions of the original controller. Here is that second version. Can't tell the difference? Well, if I put this up, you might still not be able to tell the difference. But if I put them a lot closer, you can see that this controller, version 2, had a longer grip. And the reason for this extension of the controller grip is primarily because the developers and the team behind the PlayStation thought that Westerners and everyone else outside of Japan might have bigger hands. They thought they had bigger hands. That's why they made the grips longer and a little bigger. But essentially, it was the same controller, had all the same features, longer grips, and this additional ferrite piece. If you've played on these consoles, you've noticed these things. They are intentionally put there to reduce noise. What that means exactly and how that works to help the game, I don't know exactly how, because I am stupid. Now, if I were to stretch the definition of a game controller, it's essentially a device you use to control a context of a video game that you're playing. So with that in mind, this should count. So this is the PlayStation mouse. The PlayStation mouse was originally released alongside the PlayStation during its launch. It was an optional peripheral you could purchase. So what exactly is it? Well, it's a classic 2-point ball mouse. See that? There's a little ball there. Haven't seen those in a while, haven't you? Yeah, I can open it now. Play with the ball.
Yeah, y'all love
On the top, you can see the Sony logo, the PlayStation logo, two clickers, the left and the right click, the left being a little wider than the right, and with a little grip on it, just so you can tell that you're holding the left click, if in case you get confused. But yeah, that's pretty much it with the PlayStation mouse. Now, this next one, some of you may or may not have heard of, but is actually considered a PlayStation controller. And that is the analog joystick controller. Look at it, it's really big. Well, the analog joystick was a Sony peripheral that they released a couple of years after the launch of the PlayStation. You'd have two joysticks on both sides, with each one having different button maps. On the left, you have the L1, R1, R2, and L2 buttons. On the right, you have the face buttons, triangle, circle, X, and square. And this little thing, this thing looks like a nipple? Yeah, that's your D-pad. Pretty cool. On the face, you have the Sony logo on the top, triangle, circle, X, and square in the center, L1, L2, R1, R2 on the opposite sides, and an engraved PlayStation logo on the bottom. On the upper right, you have the mode switch, which essentially allowed you to turn this into a digital controller, meaning your analog sticks would function as a D-pad. If you switch into analog mode, then you can fully utilize the possibilities of analog with compatible games. The upper left, you have select and start, and that rounds off this whole thing. Now, the reason you might not have heard of this was soon after its release, it was phased out. Why was it phased out? Well, look at it. It's huge. It's Where would you put this? Where would you keep this? And it was very expensive to buy. Look at that. But Sony knew they were onto something. You'll never guess what this thing inspired. Y'all love it. Y'all have heard of it. It's the dual analog. Not what you're expecting. We'll get there. Just bear with me. So the dual analog was released a few years after the analog joystick controller. And it looks very familiar. Why? Because it was the predecessor of the DualShock. But the major difference is, well, you had the classic design of the controller. The difference is you have these two nipples, these two analogs now. And this essentially allowed you to intuitively rest your thumbs on it. Now, the difference that it had with the DualShock was that the analog sticks themselves were a single piece plastic and they were concave. You know, everybody thought that this later controller that we're going to talk about did it first, but no. They've actually did it before. So what else did they add? They added a wider L2 and R2 button with a little divot in the top. You know, so if you're... Am I pressing the right button? It's a little good. Yeah, this is L2, R2. And that's what that was for. And they've added an analog switch in the middle. So how did that function? Well, it essentially was the switch that you found on the analog joystick controller. And it had 3 modes. When the LED light is off, that means you're playing it on a digital mode. Meaning the analog sticks work like D-pad. But if it was in red, you were playing in analog mode. So certain games that allowed you to use the analog controller function, this thing would give you. And there's a third mode that lit the LED light up green. That is the flight stick mode. Now certain games fully equipped the analog joystick's dual analog to kind of simulate if you were piloting like a plane or some kind of vehicle. And with that mode, you essentially had a mini analog joystick controller. So this was an immediate answer to the analog joystick. It was cheaper, smaller, and more readily available. But why is this such a rare thing? Well, it was phased out a few years after its release, just like the analog joystick. And for the reasons, well, let me just show you. This was the original controller, like I did show you. It's the analog joystick. Look at how long the grips were. That's a big jump. Now this was version 2. If I was to pull out version 1 right here, you can see just how comically long that is. Look at that. That's a big difference. The Japanese consumers essentially complained about how the grips were a little too long. Why wouldn't this sell anywhere else? Well, the complaints international consumers had was, if you're not from Japan, this thing didn't have a rumble feature. It didn't have the feedback vibrations that we've all come to know and love. But that meant that Sony knew exactly what to do with the next model. You know, that's the thing people miss. Well, I miss personally. Companies listening, you know, they just listen to feedback and improve based on the feedback. Now, for the granddaddy himself, the original DualShock. Now, the DualShock, coming from the dual analog, had a lot of differences, but actually had the base form factor still intact. So what does that mean? The L2 and R2 buttons lost that little divot they had on the top. They actually made them wider, just a tad bit wider. And in the middle of the controller, you can see that they've changed the analog sticks considerably. They are now 2 pieces, a plastic and a rubberized grip. And they went for a more concave form factor, which they then proceeded to use up until the PS3. Now in the middle, the analog switch button is still there, but they've lost the flight stick mode and they've kind of sunken down the buttons a little bit compared to the dual analog. Why did they do this? Well, primarily because it was reported that the dual analog users would change the mode accidentally mid-game. Can you imagine playing competitive multiplayer games and accidentally switching your modes in-game? Imagine if you were in a firefight or something like that. That would suck, like a lot. They've also reduced the size of the hand grips. Thank God. They were now more realistic to the hands of the user and they fit snugly. Now these were introduced in the dual analog, but they weren't used as much. But it's essentially another set of buttons with the introduction of the analog sticks. And that's the L3 and the R3 button. Now, if you were a kid and you've never held one of these things before, I remember this very well. And the game tells you, press the L3 button.
What? Mine only goes up to 2. Mom, can we get another? Mine only goes up to 2. It says L3.
When they released the PlayStation 2, they released a smaller, compact, and portable PS1, which was essentially the same PlayStation that you've all known and loved, but smaller. They've released the DualShock again with a different color scheme. This one's kind of yellow because, you know, it's old, and I've actually used this thing. But in its heyday, it had the same color scheme as the PS1. And if you notice, the buttons themselves have gotten a more bluish grayish tint than the flat dark grays of its original counterpart. But it was essentially the same DualShock. Now there is a saying that every sequel sucks. They will never live up to the hype of the original, and they usually take it way too far. But in this case, this is kind of like Shrek 2, with all the familiar things we know and love. Some new additions that we may or may not like, but it's at the heart of it, it's still Shrek, and we love it. I really like Shrek. This is the DualShock 2. Now, the DualShock 2 does not really stray too far from the original design of the DualShock, but it's adopted a sleek black design that's reflective of the color scheme of the console. Now, what's new with this? Well, the L1, L2, R1, R2 buttons are now a lot more tactile and are a little raised compared to the original DualShock. Let's listen to that. You hear that? Ah, bless. Other than that, we still have the same configuration of the whole face of the controller. Face buttons on the right, D-pad on the left. But now we have this little label on top that says DualShock 2. Just so if you forget, this ain't your papa's DualShock. This is cool. This is sleek. Gets all the chick. Yeah, that's as far as I take that. Another thing that a lot of people forget about the DualShock 2 was that other than the L3, R3, actually have pressure sensitive buttons. Meaning that the stronger you press them, that will actually translate in-game. So if you ever played Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, you're like, if I press X just a little stronger, I run fast. Well, you actually do. So suck on that, Matt. You always made fun of me for believing that, you piece of shit. Now, as we're moving forward, you do realize that every controller up to this point, except this one controller that we're going to talk about, is now wireless. So, just a little note, because I noticed I didn't talk about it. The original PlayStation port, squared rounded edges. Now compare that to the PS1's DualShock, semicircle. The drastic design change from that to the PS2's more squared out, but still rounded in the edges. Whew! See? I remembered. Now after the DualShock 2, where do you think Sony went? They went with a great design with this next. Oh my god, what the hell is that? Get it away from me. That was an overreaction on my part. I'm sorry. But hey, it's the DualShock 3. It's not a DualShock 3. It's the SIXAXIS. Now the SIXAXIS still holds the same traditional form factor of the PlayStation controller. The major differences are it's wireless. Now, it was charged with a mini B USB on the top. And you can see that there's the USB icon with the port. And on the upper left, you can see it just says SIXAXIS. Why isn't it DualShock 3? Well, they chose not to call it the DualShock 3 because it lacked the rumble features. Now, there's a lot of reasons why they didn't put it in here, but one of the most popular was that a Sony representative at the time said, Rumble's such a last-gen feature. Nobody bought that shit. They wanted the rumble back. But let's go over this either way. So now we have on the front the charging port, the LED lights opposite the SIXAXIS label. Now you can see it says 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now the PS3 can actually support up to 8 players depending on the game. Now, how does one represent player 5 to 8 if you only had 4 LED lights? More than one light would show up, and the sum of those lights is your player number. Now on the face of it, we still have the analog sticks, same pressure sensitive buttons, but the L1 and L2, R1, R2 buttons have seen a drastic change. They've sunk down a little deeper and are not as tactile as the DualShock 2. And as you can see, the L2 and R2 buttons are now triggers, meaning they've lost the lower housing. But a major complaint this got from a lot of people was that it felt really squishy and you were prone to having your fingers slip out of the L2 and R2 buttons because of how curved they were and just how they felt. Other than that, they lost the analog switch in the middle because moving forward, every game now supports analog. So they didn't see the need for that anymore. They replaced that with a dual PS icon button, which was your home button, which allowed you to leave your game and jump back in just like they did with the PSP. The SIXAXIS was called the SIXAXIS because of a new function they've added into this, which was motion controls. Now, it had 6 axes of movement. They essentially said they had to remove the motors to support this new technology they had. And yeah, they did it before the Wii. Is that an achievement? Maybe. Some people. Do what you want with that information. But now this was the actual DualShock 3. The most immediate way you can tell that you are holding a DualShock 3 and not a 6-axis, aside from looking at the labels on the top, this one now has DualShock 3 on it, this one does not, was that the DualShock 3 was considerably a lot heavier than the 6-axis. I don't know why I'm doing this or why anyone does this on video, no one can feel that. So what was the major difference? Well, it had rumble. So they could actually fit rumbles into this controller without sacrificing the 6-axis motion technology. Now, God, I love this controller. The DualShock 4. Now, as you can see, it's a far cry from the original design of the PlayStation controllers. I mean, at the base, it's still the same controller you know and love. D-pad on the left, base buttons on the right, analog sticks, and the L1, L2, R1, R2 buttons. But it just feels different. And this is the case because from the PS4 moving forward, Teiyu Goto did not design it. They handed the reins for engineering and architecture of the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 to Mark Cerny. Y'all remember Mark Cerny? Knack was a good game, right? Now, other than the curvier look, Mark Cerny actually partnered with Bungie to design the DualShock 4 to work really well with first-person shooters. Because Bungie made Halo, All Rise for the gaming national anthem. They've lost the sunken crosses on both sides of the face button. On the left, you see that there are triangles that would represent the direction, if you couldn't tell where they were going. And the angles are a lot steeper in the center, so you know where to rest your thumb. Yeah, that feels good. Both sides now have a flat circular plane that the buttons rest on. Now, on the top, you can see that they've kept the trigger design of the PS3's DualShock 3, but they've curved the L2 and R2 button just enough that it provides maximum comfort and you are not prone to slipping off anymore. Now, an interesting thing when it comes to the design of the DualShock 4 was that the L1, L2, R1, R2 buttons, up to that point, only had the numbers on it. 1, 1, 2, and 2. And it was on the top that you can see L and R. Here, that's not the case. They're now called L1, L2, R1, and R2. And they're flipped. Because if you were playing a game and you wanted to make sure you were pressing the right button, you wouldn't do this. No. What would come naturally is you do this. Pretty neat. On the bottom, you see that there's a headphone jack with an extension port. So if you had the proprietary charger that could allow you to charge from the bottom, that's what that was for. You can now plug in your headphones, so you don't need to buy expensive wireless headphones for your console. The analog sticks have returned to being concave, like they did in the dual analog. See, that was the first time they did it. But they still had the rubberized grip. And the home button now lacks the jeweled design that the PS3's DualShock 3 had. But it's still welcome there. But on top of that, there is now a speaker on the DualShock 4. Note to add a level of immersion never seen in gaming. The Wii did it first with the Wiimote. Y'all remember the Wiimote, right? They had a speaker on the Wiimote. The start and select buttons have been phased out and renamed to the options and the share button. What was that in the middle? That is a touchpad. It's essentially a button that also acts as a touchpad for the DualShock 4. This would have been a cool addition if a lot more developers used it in their games. And not that many did, sadly. So you know what happens? They're not supporting it. You can see on top what a lot of PS4 owners had a problem with, which I never really saw a problem with initially, was the LED light. Now, what was this LED light for? Well, other than showing colors to represent your player number, it also worked in tandem with the 6-axis motion controls. Yes, this thing still had it, with a camera that you can buy optionally, and it essentially turned this thing into a PlayStation Move controller. Ooh, remember those things with the balls on top? Yeah, that ball is this LED strip. Now, if you want me to cover the PlayStation Move, comment below. And remember to subscribe, and maybe I will, maybe I won't. Hit that notification bell, just so you know. Now, it was still a wireless controller, and it charged not with the mini B, but now with the micro B USB. It now had a two-tone design. What do I mean by that? Well, the side that rests on your palms now have more texture than the semi-gloss finish of the top face. And that is the DualShock 4. Now this would have been an interesting trivia, but Sony marketed this thing as the version 2. So, you know, it's not a secret that there are 2 versions of the DualShock 4. Now, it held the same functionality as the original DualShock. It had an improved battery. And now there is a translucent part of the touchpad on the top that allowed you to see your LED light from underneath, essentially making a light strip. But one thing that they've changed that a lot of people were clamoring about was, can we please dim the LED lights? And they replied with the version 2, which allowed you to now dim the lights to save controller battery. So that's why they didn't like the lights. It ate up battery. That is understandable. Now, aside from that, it is still the same base controller. But here's a little tip. This is one major way for you to tell if you're using a version 2 or a version 1 DualShock 4 without having to turn it on and see if there's a LED strip on top. If you look closely, these controllers have different colors in terms of the plastic used on their buttons, as well as the grip textured side underneath. The version 2 had a grayer color scheme, while the version 1 went with the more sleek black color scheme. So the best way you can see this, aside from the face buttons, was the shoulder buttons, the L1, L2, R1, R2. See that? Look at that. Stark difference. Now, if you can give me a minute, I just like to gush on this next controller. Just look at it. It's so cute. It's a 1-to-1 replica of the original controller. And you can prove that right now. Look at that. That's great. Now, the L1, L2, R1, R2 buttons have been improved ever so slightly. We now have the tactile feel of the DualShock 2. But essentially, this was the same controller. And the best part was the port. Look at that, it's a tiny PS1 port. But a USB. Now, if this was plugged into the PlayStation Classic, God, it just looks so cute. And minute over, yeah. The PlayStation Classic was an utter disappointment. And it was where do I even begin with it? And finally, we have what y'all been waiting for. The DualShock 5. The DualSense 5. The DualSense. God, got it. I got it. Now, the DualSense, if you thought the DualShock 4 was a far cry of the original design, look at this thing. It's a 2-tone color design. So it had white and black plastics around the whole design to reflect the design of the PlayStation 5. Now, what were the major differences aside from this drastic color change? Well, we still had 2 textures on it. Where the controller would rest in your hands had a little texture to it. And if you zoom in really close, you can see that the textures are actually the 4 shapes of the face button. Now, on the face of it, you can see that it has a wider design overall, kind of reminiscent of an Xbox controller. Yeah, I'll give it to the Xbox. Their controllers feel really comfortable. What's up with batteries? What's up with that? Why can't you just charge them? Now, we still have the concave analog sticks, but now they have a textured rim around it. You know, just so if your fingers slip off, I don't know when that happens, but what do you do? In the middle, you see that the PlayStation Home button has now been replaced with a cut logo, meaning there is no circle anymore. It has the PlayStation logo snug in that centerpiece. Below it, you can see that there is a new button and a new feature that this controller has, a built-in microphone. Now, this button, when lit, signifies that your microphone is on mute. Above that, with the same thing with the DualShock 4, you have built-in speakers. Below, there's the headphone jack with the extension ports. And on top, you can see, despite not being used that much, it's still here. It's the touchpad. But then they did lose the LED light on the front, but instead had the light move around the touchpad. It's a cool addition. Now, the option and the share buttons are still there, but the share button was renamed to Create to promote the new content editing software that the PS5 has. So now you had options and Create button. On the right and left side, you still had the face buttons and the D-pad, but they've taken on the dual treatment like the home button of the DualShock 3. And one thing I have to say I'm on the fence about is they took away the colors, dude. Like, the colors were a great part of the controller, but I mean, it looks sleek, right? But the colors though. On the front, you can see that you can now charge your controller with a Type-C, because everything now is Type-C. So thank God they chose Type-C first. Sony logo. And on opposite side, you can see that the L1, L2, R1, R2 buttons have now become considerably wider. They've lost the gap in between, and they've relegated the labels to being on the corners. It's still flipped, so you know. Yep. Now, why was this not called a DualShock? Well, it essentially still is a DualShock, but the major difference this thing has now is a fine-tuned haptic feedback, meaning it used voice coil actuators, which was a precise form of vibration, meaning if you were to play a game and you were walking on the sand or on water, the vibrations would feel different. They weren't just gonna buzz in, they felt tactile, they felt unique. But the major thing that I have to say I love about this controller, other than its comfort, look at it, was the adaptive triggers. Now the adaptive triggers actually allowed the game to fight back. Not literally, but if you were to shoot a gun in Resident Evil 8 Village, a pistol would feel very different than a shotgun. Now the pistol wouldn't put up much of a fight when pulling back the R2, but the shotgun had a little bit more, you had to put a little bit more strength into it. And that's why they called it the DualSense. Other than the haptic feedback, it also had the adaptive triggers. And it just looks really good. But the colors though. 5 generations. Man, we've come a long way, haven't we? And you can see, it wasn't an easy ride to get to where we are now, from the original controller to the DualSense. And it makes me excited to see what the future holds in terms of gaming. If you enjoyed that video, please remember to subscribe and hit that notification icon. You can also follow me on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram. I also stream on Twitch every Tuesday and Thursday. At least I try to. But most of my updates will be on Facebook. If you haven't already, subscribing, liking, and hitting the notification icon helps a lot. And with that, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.